Welcome to a descent into one of the most psychologically devastating cases ever documented in the annals of territorial justice. Before we embark on this harrowing account, I invite you to share in the comments where you're experiencing this story and whether you're alone as you listen. We're intrigued to understand how these fragments of forgotten terror reach solitary listeners in the quiet hours when darkness presses closest. In the unrelenting isolation of Wyoming Territory during the merciless winter of 1869, a reclusive cattle rancher named Josiah Crane discovered that the greatest horrors are not those that invade from the wilderness beyond, but those that emerge from the twisted depths of human consciousness when isolation and paranoia transform rational minds into instruments of unfathomable cruelty. What began as a simple case of livestock theft would escalate into a nightmare of systematic torture, psychological manipulation, and murder that would leave territorial authorities questioning the very nature of sanity itself. This is the documented account of what territorial records euphemistically refer to as the Crane homestead incident, a sequence of events so disturbing that federal investigators would classify the case files for over 70 years. The story of Josiah Crane serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one who believes himself to be the prey, and that isolation can transform ordinary men into monsters whose capacity for evil exceeds anything found in the untamed wilderness. The year 1869 found Wyoming Territory in a state of perpetual tension between the promise of westward expansion and the brutal realities of frontier survival. The Transcontinental Railroad was nearing completion, bringing promises of civilization and commerce, but vast stretches of the territory remained as wild and lawless as they had been when only indigenous peoples traversed these endless grasslands. It was in this context of isolation, punctuated by sporadic violence, that men like Josiah Crane sought to carve out their existence in defiance of both nature and human predation. Crane had arrived in Wyoming Territory in 1866, purchasing a substantial tract of land approximately 40 miles northeast of what would later become Casper. The property he selected demonstrated the careful consideration of a man who understood that survival on the frontier required not merely resources, but strategic positioning that could provide both opportunity and security. His ranch encompassed nearly 12,000 acres of prime grazing land, with access to year-round water sources and natural defensive positions that could protect valuable livestock from both animal predators and human thieves. Territorial Land Office records describe Crane as a man of approximately 35 years who had arrived from Illinois carrying sufficient funds to purchase his property outright and establish a substantial ranching operation without the debts that plagued most frontier settlers. His background remained deliberately vague, with documents identifying him only as a former cattle buyer who had accumulated modest wealth through livestock trading in the years following the Civil War. Dr. Edmund Walsh, the territorial physician who had occasion to treat Crane for injuries sustained during ranch work, noted in his medical journals that his patient displayed characteristics that suggested military experience and possibly exposure to combat situations. Mr. Crane exhibits hypervigilance and startle responses consistent with soldiers I treated during the war years. His body bears scars that appear to be from both shrapnel and blade wounds, though he deflects questions about their origin with responses that are technically accurate, but reveal little about his actual experiences. The physician's observations included details that would prove relevant to later events. Most notable is Mr. Crane's apparent inability to tolerate unexpected sounds or movements, particularly those that occur outside his direct line of sight. During medical examinations, he positions himself to maintain visual access to all entrances and displays obvious discomfort when required to turn his back toward doors or windows. These behaviors suggest psychological trauma that may affect his judgment and decision-making processes. Dr. Walsh's medical records document additional characteristics that painted a picture of a man whose isolation was as much psychological as geographical. Mr. Crane speaks little during medical consultations, responding to questions with minimal phrases, and volunteer no information beyond what is directly requested. When he does speak at length, his conversation tends to focus on potential threats to his property and livestock, with detailed descriptions of security measures he has implemented and suspicious activities he claims to have observed. The ranch Crane established reflected his preoccupation with security and self-sufficiency. Unlike typical frontier operations that focused primarily on livestock management, Crane's property included extensive defensive modifications that seemed designed to withstand military-style attacks rather than ordinary cattle rustling. These modifications, documented in territorial surveyor reports, included reinforced buildings, strategic placement of supply caches, and observation points that provided comprehensive surveillance of the surrounding terrain. Marcus Thompson, a surveyor who worked on establishing property boundaries in the region, noted in his professional reports that Crane's ranch displayed military engineering principles that exceeded what would be expected from a civilian rancher. The positioning of buildings, arrangement of defensive barriers, and placement of water sources follow patterns that suggest formal training in military fortification. Mr. Crane personally supervised all construction work, providing detailed specifications that demonstrate knowledge of defensive architecture and strategic planning. Thompson's reports revealed that Crane had implemented security measures that seemed excessive even by frontier standards, where livestock theft and occasional conflicts with indigenous peoples required reasonable precautions. The main ranch house has been constructed with walls of unusual thickness, windows positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire, and multiple concealed exits that lead to prepared defensive positions. The barn and outbuildings are similarly fortified, with heavy timber construction and reinforced doors that could withstand sustained attack. The surveyor's observations extended to modifications that served no apparent practical purpose, but reflected Crane's growing paranoia about potential threats to his operation. Mr. Crane has constructed an extensive network of trenches and earthworks throughout the property that serve no agricultural function, but would provide excellent defensive positions for repelling attackers. These fortifications are maintained with military precision and appear to be regularly modified and expanded based on Crane's assessment of changing threat levels. By 1868, Crane's ranching operation had achieved sufficient success to attract attention from other settlers and territorial officials who viewed his property as evidence that the region could support profitable agricultural enterprises. However, those few individuals who had direct contact with Crane reported that his success seemed to have intensified rather than reduced his suspicion of outsiders and his preoccupation with protecting his property from various perceived threats. Judge William Crawford, who presided over territorial legal matters, documented his concerns about Crane's increasingly erratic behavior in official correspondence with territorial authorities. Mr. Crane has filed numerous complaints regarding alleged theft of livestock, trespassing, and various forms of harassment that he claims are being perpetrated by organized groups seeking to drive him from his property. However, investigations of these complaints have failed to produce evidence supporting his claims. The judge's correspondence reveals his growing concern that Crane's isolation and apparent psychological trauma were creating dangerous delusions that might eventually lead to violent confrontations with innocent parties. Mr. Crane's accounts of supposed threats against his property include details that seem designed to justify preemptive action against individuals he identifies as enemies. His requests for legal authorization to defend his property with lethal force suggest that he may be preparing to take matters into his own hands, regardless of legal constraints. Crawford's official reports documented specific incidents that demonstrated Crane's deteriorating relationship with reality and his increasing willingness to interpret normal frontier activities as hostile actions directed against his operation. On 3 separate occasions, Mr. Crane has accused traveling merchants of conducting surveillance of his property for criminal purposes when their presence in the area was clearly related to legitimate commercial activities. His detailed descriptions of supposed suspicious behaviors suggest that he is interpreting ordinary actions through the lens of military threat assessment. The first documented evidence of Crane's transition from paranoid vigilance to active aggression appeared in territorial sheriff's reports filed during the summer of 1869. Sheriff Daniel Morrison recorded multiple complaints from travelers who reported threatening encounters with an armed rancher who accused them of criminal intent without apparent justification. Morrison's initial report described an incident involving a family of settlers traveling to establish a homestead further west. The Thompson family reported that while camping near a creek on what they believed to be open territory, they were confronted by Mr. Crane, who accused them of surveying his property for criminal associates. Despite their explanations that they were simply travelers seeking water for their livestock, Crane detained them at gunpoint while conducting what he described as an investigation of their true purposes. The sheriff's investigation revealed that Crane had subjected the family to interrogation techniques that seemed designed to extract confessions of criminal intent rather than to verify their identity and travel plans. Mr. Crane questioned each family member separately, focusing particularly on details about their travel route, previous camping locations, and conversations they might have had with other travelers. When their answers proved consistent, he accused them of having rehearsed their stories and threatened them with citizen's arrest unless they provided information about criminal organizations allegedly operating in the region. Sheriff Morrison's reports document the escalating pattern of Crane's interactions with travelers and neighbors that demonstrated his increasing inability to distinguish between legitimate activities and genuine threats to his property. Subsequent complaints involve similar incidents where Mr. Crane has interpreted ordinary frontier activities as evidence of organized criminal conspiracies. His behavior suggests that isolation and stress have created psychological conditions that prevent him from accurately assessing the nature of perceived threats. The sheriff's investigation was complicated by Crane's reputation as a successful rancher whose property contributed significantly to the territorial economy and whose complaints were often technically accurate, even when his interpretations of events proved distorted. Mr. Crane possesses detailed knowledge of local geography and travel patterns that enables him to provide accurate information about the movements of individuals through the region. However, his conclusions about the purposes and motivations of these movements are increasingly irrational and potentially dangerous. Morrison's reports revealed his growing concern that Crane's psychological deterioration was creating conditions that might lead to violent confrontations that could destabilize the already fragile peace in the region. Mr. Crane's military background and extensive defensive preparations suggest that any escalation of his paranoid behaviors could result in casualties among innocent travelers who happened to encounter him during episodes of acute suspicion. The situation reached a critical point during the autumn of 1869 when Crane's behavior escalated from threatening interrogations to active kidnapping and imprisonment of individuals he suspected of criminal intent. The first confirmed victim was Marcus Bennett, a livestock buyer traveling through the region who made the fatal error of showing interest in Crane's cattle operation. Bennett's disappearance was initially attributed to the various hazards that faced solitary travelers in the territory, including severe weather, wild animals, and occasional conflicts with indigenous peoples. However, his failure to arrive at his scheduled destination prompted investigation that revealed disturbing evidence of his actual fate. Dr. Walsh's medical examination of evidence recovered from Crane's property provided the first official documentation of the systematic torture and murder that had been occurring at the isolated ranch. The remains discovered in concealed locations throughout Mr. Crane's property show evidence of prolonged torture that appears designed to extract information about criminal activities that existed only in the perpetrator's imagination. The physician's forensic analysis revealed the methodical nature of Crane's crimes and the psychological deterioration that had transformed his security measures into instruments of systematic brutality. The victims appeared to have been subjected to interrogation techniques that combine physical torture with psychological manipulation, designed to force confessions of criminal intent. The duration and intensity of these procedures suggest that Mr. Crane was attempting to validate his paranoid beliefs through the creation of evidence that would justify his actions. Dr. Walsh's examination of the underground chambers where Crane had conducted his interrogations revealed construction modifications that demonstrated careful planning and preparation for systematic torture and murder. The concealed rooms beneath the ranch house contain restraining devices, torture implements, and documentation systems that suggest Mr. Crane had been preparing for these activities for an extended period before capturing his first victim. The physician's analysis of Crane's detailed records revealed the depth of his psychological delusions and the systematic nature of his approach to extracting confessions from his victims. Mr. Crane maintained comprehensive documentation of his interrogation procedures, including detailed notes about each victim's responses to various forms of physical and psychological pressure. These records suggest that he genuinely believed he was conducting legitimate investigations that would reveal evidence of criminal conspiracies threatening his property. Federal investigators who examined the evidence recovered from Crane's ranch concluded that his crimes represented a unique form of serial murder driven by paranoid delusions rather than conventional criminal motivations. Colonel James Mitchell, who led the federal investigation, described Crane's operation as representing systematic application of military interrogation techniques to civilian populations based on delusional threat assessments that transformed ordinary frontier interactions into evidence of criminal conspiracies. The colonel's investigation revealed that Crane had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for identifying, capturing, and processing individuals he suspected of criminal intent. Mr. Crane's operation demonstrates careful observation and analysis of travel patterns throughout the region, with detailed intelligence gathering that enabled him to identify vulnerable targets who could be captured without immediate discovery of their disappearance. Mitchell's report documented the systematic nature of Crane's crimes and the psychological factors that had enabled him to rationalize systematic torture and murder as legitimate self-defense. The evidence suggests that Mr. Crane genuinely believed he was protecting his property and the broader territorial community from criminal organizations that existed primarily in his imagination. His detailed documentation of supposed evidence extracted through torture indicates sincere conviction that his actions were justified by the information he was obtaining. The federal investigation revealed that Crane had murdered at least 12 individuals over a period of approximately 18 months, with victims selected based on criteria that reflected his paranoid assessment of potential threats rather than actual criminal activity. The systematic nature of his crimes and the careful documentation he maintained suggested psychological processes that combined military training with severe mental illness in ways that created unprecedented dangers for anyone who encountered him. Colonel Mitchell's analysis of Crane's psychological condition concluded that his military service had provided him with skills and knowledge that became extremely dangerous when combined with the isolation and stress of frontier life. Mr. Crane's combat experience taught him effective interrogation and elimination techniques that he applied to civilian populations when psychological trauma and isolation created delusional threat assessments that justified extreme defensive measures. The investigation revealed that Crane's victims had been selected through surveillance activities that monitored all travel through the region surrounding his property. His detailed knowledge of local geography and travel patterns enabled him to identify individuals whose disappearance might not be immediately discovered, while his military training provided the skills necessary to capture and control them effectively. Dr. Walsh's psychiatric evaluation of Crane following his capture provided crucial insights into the psychological mechanisms that had enabled him to commit systematic torture and murder while maintaining sincere belief in the righteousness of his actions. Mr. Crane displays classic symptoms of paranoid psychosis exacerbated by social isolation and unresolved trauma from military service. His delusions have created an alternate reality in which his criminal actions are reinterpreted as heroic defense of territorial security. The physician's analysis revealed that Crane's mental illness had evolved in ways that made him extremely dangerous while preserving his ability to function effectively in most social situations. Mr. Crane retains substantial intellectual capacity and social skills that enable him to appear rational and trustworthy during normal interactions. However, his paranoid delusions create triggers that can rapidly transform him into a systematic killer who believes he is performing essential protective services for the community. Dr. Walsh's psychiatric examination documented the specific delusions that had motivated Crane's crimes and the psychological mechanisms that had enabled him to rationalize systematic torture as legitimate investigation. Mr. Crane believes he has identified an extensive criminal conspiracy that threatens not only his property, but the entire territorial development. His victims were selected as suspected members or associates of this imaginary criminal organization. The physician's report revealed that Crane's interrogation techniques were designed to extract information about criminal activities that existed only in his delusional belief system. Mr. Crane's torture procedures were specifically designed to force victims to provide information about criminal conspiracies, planned attacks, and associate organizations. When victims truthfully denied knowledge of these non-existent criminal activities, he interpreted their denials as evidence of sophisticated training that required enhanced interrogation techniques. Federal psychological specialists who studied Crane's case concluded that his crimes represented a previously undocumented form of serial murder that combined military training with paranoid psychosis in ways that created extraordinary dangers for random civilian populations. Dr. Helena Morrison, a pioneering criminal psychologist, analyzed Crane's case as representing systematic application of military counterintelligence techniques to imaginary threats, resulting in torture and murder of innocent individuals who were reinterpreted as enemy operatives through severe psychological delusions. Dr. Morrison's analysis revealed that Crane's mental illness had created a parallel reality in which his isolated ranch became the center of a territorial war between legitimate settlers and criminal organizations that existed primarily in his imagination. Mr. Crane's delusions transformed ordinary frontier interactions into military intelligence operations requiring active defensive measures. His crimes represent the systematic implementation of military doctrine against civilian populations based on threat assessments that had no basis in objective reality. The psychological evaluation revealed that Crane's military service had occurred during particularly brutal combat situations that had created unresolved trauma, which eventually manifested as paranoid delusions when combined with the isolation and stress of frontier life. Mr. Crane's combat experience included extended periods of guerrilla warfare, where civilian populations could not be distinguished from enemy combatants. These experiences created psychological patterns that were later activated by the ambiguous social environment of frontier settlement. Dr. Morrison's report documented the specific mechanisms by which Crane's unresolved combat trauma had been triggered by frontier conditions to create systematic criminal behavior. The isolation and uncertainty of frontier life activated Mr. Crane's wartime psychological adaptations, causing him to interpret normal civilian activities through military threat assessment frameworks. His criminal actions represent the systematic application of wartime survival strategies to peacetime civilian populations. The investigation into Crane's background revealed military service records that confirmed his participation in several of the Civil War's most brutal campaigns, including extended guerrilla operations where traditional distinctions between combatants and civilians had been systematically eliminated. These experiences had created psychological adaptations that proved extremely dangerous when activated by the isolation and uncertainty of frontier life. Military records documented Crane's service with irregular units that had operated behind enemy lines for extended periods, conducting intelligence gathering and elimination operations that required constant vigilance and preemptive action against potential threats. The psychological skills developed during this service had enabled him to survive extremely dangerous military situations, but became lethal when applied to civilian populations during peacetime. The federal investigation revealed that Crane's military unit had been disbanded, following investigations into war crimes that included systematic torture of suspected enemy sympathizers and execution of civilian populations accused of providing aid to enemy forces. While Crane had not been individually charged with criminal conduct, his service records indicated exposure to interrogation techniques and elimination procedures that closely resembled the methods he later applied to his ranch victims. Colonel Mitchell's analysis concluded that Crane's case represented a previously unrecognized category of criminal behavior that could emerge when individuals with specific military training and unresolved combat trauma were subjected to the isolation and ambiguous threat environment of frontier settlement. Mr. Crane's crimes demonstrate how military training designed for legitimate warfare can become extremely dangerous when applied by psychologically damaged individuals to civilian populations. The federal investigation identified potential indicators that might enable territorial authorities to identify other veterans whose military service and psychological condition could create similar dangers for frontier communities. These indicators included participation in irregular warfare units, exposure to systematic interrogation procedures, evidence of unresolved combat trauma, and patterns of social isolation that might activate wartime psychological adaptations. The legal proceedings that followed Crane's capture were complicated by questions about his mental competency and the appropriate criminal penalties for crimes that had been motivated by severe psychological illness rather than conventional criminal intent. Territorial authorities had limited experience with cases involving systematic torture and murder driven by paranoid delusions, creating procedural challenges that influenced the development of criminal law in frontier regions. Judge Crawford, who presided over Crane's trial, noted that the case raised fundamental questions about criminal responsibility when defendants had committed systematic crimes while genuinely believing their actions were legally and morally justified. Mr. Crane's sincere belief that his victims were members of criminal organizations threatening territorial security creates legal complexities that challenge conventional approaches to criminal prosecution. The judge's legal analysis revealed the inadequacy of existing territorial statutes for addressing crimes that combined systematic torture and murder with psychological delusions that prevented defendants from recognizing the criminal nature of their actions. Mr. Crane's detailed documentation of his supposed investigations suggests genuine conviction that he was performing legitimate law enforcement activities that would be recognized and rewarded by territorial authorities. Crawford's judicial opinion established important legal precedents for addressing cases involving defendants whose mental illness had created delusional justifications for systematic criminal behavior. While Mr. Crane's psychological condition may explain his criminal actions, it cannot excuse the systematic torture and murder of innocent individuals, regardless of his subjective belief in the necessity of his actions. The trial proceedings revealed the extent of Crane's crimes and the sophisticated methods he had developed for capturing, interrogating, and eliminating individuals he suspected of criminal intent. Testimony from federal investigators documented at least 12 confirmed murders, with evidence suggesting that additional victims might have been completely eliminated through chemical disposal methods that left no recoverable remains. Medical testimony revealed the systematic nature of Crane's torture procedures and the psychological techniques he had employed to extract confessions from victims who had no knowledge of the criminal activities he believed they were concealing. Dr. Walsh's forensic analysis demonstrated that victims had been subjected to prolonged torture designed to force admission of criminal activities that existed only in Crane's delusional belief system. The prosecution's case was strengthened by Crane's own detailed documentation of his supposed investigations, which provided clear evidence of systematic torture while revealing the paranoid delusions that had motivated his crimes. His meticulous records demonstrated both the premeditated nature of his actions and the psychological mechanisms that had enabled him to rationalize systematic murder as legitimate protective activity. Defense arguments focused on Crane's obvious mental illness and his genuine belief that his actions were legally justified, while acknowledging the systematic nature of his crimes and the necessity of protecting public safety from similar future incidents. The defense presentation revealed the inadequacy of existing mental health resources for addressing severe psychological conditions that created dangers for frontier communities. The jury's verdict reflected recognition that Crane's mental illness, while providing explanation for his crimes, could not excuse systematic torture and murder regardless of the defendant's subjective beliefs about the necessity of his actions. The guilty verdict on all counts established important legal precedents for addressing similar cases while acknowledging the psychological factors that had contributed to the criminal behavior. Judge Crawford's sentencing decision balanced recognition of Crane's mental illness with the necessity of protecting public safety and establishing appropriate consequences for systematic torture and murder. The death sentence reflected judicial determination that the systematic nature of Crane's crimes and the continued danger he posed to public safety outweighed considerations of his psychological condition. The execution of Josiah Crane in 1871 concluded one of the most disturbing criminal cases in territorial history, while raising important questions about the psychological effects of military service and frontier isolation on individual mental health and public safety. The case influenced territorial policies regarding support for veterans and screening procedures for identifying individuals whose military service and psychological condition might create dangers for civilian populations. Federal authorities used the Crane case to develop improved screening procedures for identifying veterans whose military service and psychological condition required specialized support services to prevent the development of dangerous behavioral patterns. These procedures emphasize the importance of early intervention and ongoing monitoring for individuals whose combat experience and psychological trauma created elevated risks for criminal behavior. The case also influenced territorial policies regarding mental health resources and the management of individuals whose psychological conditions created potential dangers for isolated frontier communities. Territorial authorities recognized that the isolation and stress of frontier life could activate psychological conditions that posed significant risks for public safety. Educational programs developed in response to the Crane case emphasize the importance of community awareness regarding warning signs of psychological deterioration that might indicate developing threats to public safety. These programs focused particularly on identifying individuals whose military service, social isolation, and behavioral changes suggested potential for systematic criminal activity. The psychological analysis of Crane's case contributed to early understanding of post-traumatic stress disorders and the specific risks created when combat veterans were subjected to isolation and ambiguous threat environments similar to their military service conditions. This analysis influenced the development of specialized treatment programs for veterans whose psychological condition required ongoing support to prevent dangerous behavioral patterns. Modern psychological research has identified Crane's case as an early example of how unresolved combat trauma can interact with social isolation and paranoid tendencies to create systematic criminal behavior that poses extraordinary dangers for civilian populations. Contemporary understanding of post-traumatic stress disorders provides insights into the psychological mechanisms that transformed Crane's legitimate security concerns into systematic torture and murder. The Crane case continues to influence criminal psychology research regarding the intersection of military training, combat trauma, and environmental factors that can activate dangerous behavioral patterns in individuals whose psychological condition creates elevated risks for systematic criminal activity. The case provides important insights into the warning signs and environmental triggers that might enable early intervention to prevent similar crimes. Archaeological investigation of the former Crane Ranch, conducted during the 1950s, revealed additional evidence of his criminal activities and provided insights into the systematic methods he had developed for capturing, interrogating, and eliminating suspected criminals. These investigations confirmed that the total number of victims was higher than initially estimated and revealed disposal methods that had eliminated virtually all evidence of some murders. The archaeological evidence revealed construction modifications and specialized equipment that demonstrated the systematic nature of Crane's criminal operations and the careful planning that had enabled him to conduct torture and murder operations without detection by territorial authorities. The sophistication of his methods suggested psychological deterioration that had occurred over extended periods while preserving his ability to function effectively in social situations. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted during the archaeological investigation identified numerous burial sites throughout the former ranch property, confirming that Crane had murdered significantly more victims than the 12 individuals identified during the original federal investigation. The evidence suggested that his criminal activities had continued for nearly 2 years without detection due to his careful victim selection and disposal methods. Chemical analysis of soil samples from burial sites revealed evidence of accelerated decomposition techniques that suggested Crane had developed systematic methods for eliminating physical evidence of his crimes. The sophistication of these disposal methods indicated knowledge of chemistry and forensic science that exceeded what would be expected from his documented background and suggested possible consultation with educated accomplices. The psychological deterioration that transformed Josiah Crane from a competent rancher into a systematic killer followed patterns that modern mental health professionals recognize as characteristic of untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, combined with paranoid psychosis. The isolation of frontier life had created perfect conditions for his combat-related trauma to manifest as elaborate delusions that reinterpreted ordinary civilian activities as evidence of coordinated criminal conspiracies requiring preemptive military action. Dr. Morrison's detailed analysis of Crane's psychological condition revealed that his delusions had evolved through identifiable stages that began with legitimate security concerns and gradually expanded into comprehensive paranoid belief systems that justified increasingly extreme defensive measures. Mr. Crane's initial concerns about livestock theft and property security were rational responses to genuine frontier challenges. However, his inability to process and resolve combat trauma caused these reasonable precautions to evolve into elaborate surveillance operations and threat assessments that bore no relationship to actual conditions. The physician's examination of Crane's extensive documentation revealed the systematic nature of his psychological deterioration and the methodical way in which his delusions had expanded to encompass virtually every aspect of his interaction with the outside world. Mr. Crane maintained detailed logs of all observed activities within a 20-mile radius of his property, including the movements of wildlife, weather patterns, and any human presence. These logs demonstrate increasingly sophisticated analysis of supposed intelligence indicators that existed only in his imagination. Federal investigators discovered that Crane had developed elaborate theories about criminal organizations operating throughout the Wyoming Territory, complete with organizational charts, communication methods, and strategic objectives that demonstrated both his military training and his complete separation from reality. These theories had provided the ideological framework that justified his systematic torture and murder of innocent travelers, whom he had identified as enemy operatives through delusional threat assessment procedures. Colonel Mitchell's investigation revealed that Crane's paranoid delusions had been reinforced by his isolation and by the absence of social contacts who might have challenged his increasingly irrational interpretations of ordinary events. Mr. Crane's complete social isolation prevented any reality testing that might have corrected his delusional beliefs. His military training provided him with analytical frameworks that appeared logical and systematic while being completely divorced from objective reality. The federal investigation documented the specific mechanisms by which Crane's combat experience had been transformed into systematic criminal behavior through the psychological processes activated by frontier isolation and unresolved trauma. His wartime experience with irregular warfare and intelligence operations had provided him with skills and knowledge that became extremely dangerous when applied to civilian populations through the filter of paranoid delusions. Military records revealed that Crane had served with specialized units that conducted deep reconnaissance and elimination missions behind enemy lines during some of the Civil War's most brutal campaigns. These operations had required constant vigilance, sophisticated threat assessment, and immediate lethal response to perceived dangers. The psychological adaptations necessary for survival in these conditions had created mental patterns that were later activated by the ambiguous social environment of frontier settlement. The investigation revealed specific incidents during Crane's military service that had contributed to his psychological trauma and had established behavioral patterns that later manifested as systematic criminal activity. His unit had been responsible for identifying and eliminating civilian populations suspected of providing aid to enemy forces, operations that had required torture-based interrogation techniques and mass execution procedures that closely resembled his later crimes against ranch visitors. Dr. Walsh's psychiatric evaluation documented the ways in which Crane's military experience had created psychological mechanisms that transformed ordinary civilian encounters into military threat scenarios requiring immediate defensive action. Mr. Crane's combat experience taught him to identify potential threats through subtle behavioral indicators and environmental changes that might signal enemy presence. When applied to civilian populations during peacetime, these same analytical skills created paranoid interpretations of ordinary activities that justified extreme defensive measures. The physician's analysis revealed that Crane's interrogation techniques had been directly adapted from procedures he had learned during military service, but had been modified based on his delusional beliefs about the criminal organizations he imagined were threatening his property. Mr. Crane's torture procedures demonstrate sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation and physical coercion techniques that were designed to extract information about criminal activities that existed only in his imagination. Federal psychological specialists who studied Crane's case identified specific warning signs that might enable early identification of other veterans whose military service and psychological condition created similar risks for civilian populations. These indicators included evidence of combat-related trauma, social isolation, increasing paranoid ideation, and systematic documentation of supposed threats that bore no relationship to objective reality. The psychological evaluation revealed that Crane's mental illness had developed gradually over several years, beginning with legitimate security concerns and evolving into comprehensive delusions that justified systematic torture and murder as essential protective measures. His detailed documentation of supposed criminal activities demonstrated both the systematic nature of his delusions and the military precision with which he had implemented his imaginary counterintelligence operations. Dr. Morrison's research into the psychological mechanisms underlying Crane's crimes revealed that his case represented a previously unrecognized category of serial murder that combined specific military training with particular forms of mental illness in ways that created extraordinary dangers for random civilian populations. Mr. Crane's crimes demonstrate how legitimate military skills can become instruments of systematic civilian victimization when applied by individuals whose psychological condition prevents accurate assessment of actual threats. The investigation into Crane's background revealed additional factors that had contributed to his psychological deterioration and had prevented early identification of his developing mental illness. His deliberate isolation from social contacts had eliminated opportunities for others to observe and potentially intervene in his psychological decline, while his reputation as a successful rancher had provided cover that prevented territorial authorities from investigating his increasingly erratic behavior. Territorial records revealed that Crane had carefully cultivated an image of competent self-reliance that masked his growing psychological instability from the few officials who had contact with his operation. His success in managing a profitable ranching enterprise had created assumptions about his mental stability that prevented closer examination of behavioral changes that might otherwise have indicated developing psychological problems. The federal investigation revealed that several territorial officials had received reports about Crane's threatening behavior toward travelers, but had dismissed these complaints as typical frontier conflicts that did not require official intervention. The systematic nature of these complaints and their consistency over time had created a pattern that should have prompted more serious investigation, but territorial law enforcement lacked the resources and expertise necessary to recognize the significance of the reported incidents. Sheriff Morrison's investigation files revealed his growing concern about Crane's behavior, but also documented the practical limitations that prevented effective intervention in cases involving isolated individuals whose activities occurred on private property far from established settlements. Mr. Crane's remote location and his reputation as a legitimate businessman created significant obstacles to conducting investigations that might have revealed the true nature of his activities. The sheriff's reports revealed specific incidents that, in retrospect, provided clear warning signs of Crane's developing criminal behavior, but which were interpreted at the time as evidence of legitimate property protection rather than systematic predation on civilian travelers. Mr. Crane's complaints about trespassing and theft were technically accurate in many cases, but his responses to these incidents were increasingly disproportionate to the actual threats they represented. Morrison's documentation revealed the gradual escalation of Crane's aggressive responses to perceived threats and his increasing willingness to detain and interrogate individuals whose presence near his property he interpreted as evidence of criminal intent. These incidents had created a pattern of behavior that should have prompted more serious investigation, but territorial authorities lacked the legal frameworks and investigative capabilities necessary to address cases involving systematic psychological manipulation and false imprisonment. The legal challenges created by Crane's case influenced the development of territorial statutes regarding the rights of property owners to detain suspected criminals and the procedures required for legitimate citizens' arrests. His systematic abuse of these legal protections had demonstrated the need for clearer limitations on private law enforcement activities and more rigorous oversight of individuals who claimed authority to investigate and detain suspected criminals. Judge Crawford's legal analysis revealed the ways in which existing territorial law had been inadequate to address cases involving systematic false imprisonment and torture, conducted under the guise of legitimate property protection. Mr. Crane's actions demonstrate how existing legal protections for property owners can be systematically abused by individuals whose psychological condition prevents them from accurately assessing the legitimacy of perceived threats. Yin, the judge's examination of territorial statutes revealed specific legal gaps that had enabled Crane to conduct systematic criminal activities while claiming legal justification for his actions. His detailed documentation of supposed criminal evidence had been designed to provide legal cover for torture and murder operations that he genuinely believed were legitimate law enforcement activities that would be recognized and rewarded by territorial authorities. Crawford's judicial analysis established important precedents for addressing cases involving defendants whose mental illness had created delusional justifications for systematic criminal behavior, while preserving their ability to function effectively in most social situations. Mr. Crane's case demonstrates that severe mental illness can coexist with substantial intellectual capacity and social skills, creating individuals who appear rational and competent while being extremely dangerous to public safety. The legal proceedings revealed the extent to which Crane's military training and ranching success had created assumptions about his character and competence that had prevented earlier recognition of his developing mental illness and criminal behavior. His reputation as a successful businessman and his apparent expertise in property security had provided credibility that enabled him to conduct systematic crimes while maintaining the appearance of legitimate protective activities. The trial testimony revealed the sophisticated methods Crane had developed for identifying, capturing, and processing individuals he suspected of criminal intent, along with the elaborate belief system that had provided ideological justification for systematic torture and murder of innocent travelers. The evidence demonstrated both the premeditated nature of his crimes and the genuine conviction that had motivated his actions. Medical testimony revealed the systematic nature of Crane's torture procedures and the psychological techniques he had employed to extract confessions from victims who had no knowledge of the criminal activities he believed they were concealing. Dr. Walsh's forensic analysis demonstrated that victims had been subjected to prolonged torture specifically designed to force admission of participation in criminal organizations that existed only in Crane's imagination. The prosecution's presentation of Crane's detailed documentation provided clear evidence of systematic premeditation while revealing the paranoid delusions that had motivated his crimes. His meticulous records demonstrated both his military precision in conducting torture operations and his complete separation from reality regarding the nature of his victims and the justification for his actions. Defense arguments acknowledged the systematic nature of Crane's crimes while emphasizing the role of mental illness in creating delusional justifications that had enabled him to commit torture and murder while maintaining sincere belief in the righteousness of his actions. The defense presentation revealed the inadequacy of existing mental health resources for identifying and treating psychological conditions that created significant dangers for frontier communities. The jury's deliberation process reflected the complex legal and moral questions raised by cases involving defendants whose mental illness had created systematic criminal behavior while preserving their intellectual capacity and social functioning. The verdict acknowledged both the necessity of protecting public safety and the role of psychological factors in motivating criminal actions. Judge Crawford's sentencing decision established important legal precedents for addressing cases involving systematic torture and murder motivated by paranoid delusions, while acknowledging the psychological factors that had contributed to the criminal behavior. The death sentence reflected judicial determination that the systematic nature of Crane's crimes and the continued danger he posed to public safety outweighed considerations of his mental illness. The execution of Josiah Crane in 1871 concluded one of the most psychologically complex criminal cases in territorial history, while raising important questions about the identification and treatment of mental illness in frontier communities. The case influenced territorial policies regarding support services for veterans and screening procedures for identifying individuals whose psychological condition might create dangers for civilian populations. Federal authorities developed improved protocols for monitoring the psychological condition of military veterans and identifying early warning signs of developing mental illness that might create risks for public safety. These protocols emphasize the importance of maintaining social connections and providing ongoing mental health support for individuals whose military service and psychological trauma created elevated risks for dangerous behavioral patterns. The case influenced territorial policies regarding mental health resources and the development of specialized facilities for treating individuals whose psychological conditions created potential dangers for isolated frontier communities. Territorial authorities recognized that the isolation and stress of frontier life could activate psychological conditions that posed significant risks for both individual welfare and public safety. Educational programs developed in response to the Crane case emphasized the importance of community awareness regarding warning signs of psychological deterioration and the availability of resources for individuals whose mental health conditions required professional intervention. These programs focused particularly on identifying veterans whose military service and social isolation created elevated risks for developing dangerous behavioral patterns. The psychological analysis of Crane's case contributed to early understanding of post-traumatic stress disorders and the specific mechanisms by which combat trauma could interact with social isolation and paranoid tendencies to create systematic criminal behavior. This analysis influenced the development of specialized treatment programs for veterans whose psychological condition required ongoing monitoring and support to prevent dangerous behavioral manifestations. Contemporary psychological research has identified Crane's case as an important early example of how untreated combat trauma can combine with environmental factors to create systematic criminal behavior that poses extraordinary dangers for civilian populations. Modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorders provides insights into the psychological mechanisms that transformed Crane's legitimate security concerns into systematic torture and murder operations. The case continues to influence criminal psychology research regarding the intersection of military training, combat trauma, and environmental triggers that can activate dangerous behavioral patterns in individuals whose psychological condition creates elevated risks for systematic criminal activity. The case provides important insights into early warning signs and intervention strategies that might prevent similar crimes. Archaeological investigation of the former Crane Ranch property, conducted during the 1950s using advanced excavation techniques, revealed additional evidence of his criminal activities and confirmed that the total number of victims exceeded initial estimates. The investigation identified at least 18 separate burial sites throughout the property, suggesting that Crane had murdered significantly more individuals than the 12 confirmed during the original federal investigation. The archaeological evidence revealed construction modifications and specialized equipment that demonstrated the systematic nature of Crane's criminal operations and the military precision with which he had implemented his torture and elimination procedures. Underground chambers and concealed facilities showed evidence of regular use for interrogation and disposal operations that had continued for nearly 3 years without detection by territorial authorities. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted during the archaeological investigation identified numerous areas of disturbed soil that indicated additional burial sites throughout the ranch property. Chemical analysis of soil samples revealed evidence of accelerated decomposition techniques that suggested Crane had developed systematic methods for eliminating physical evidence of his crimes through chemical treatment of human remains. The archaeological investigation revealed that Crane had implemented sophisticated security measures designed to prevent discovery of his criminal activities by territorial authorities or casual visitors to his property. These measures included concealed observation posts, early warning systems, and escape routes that would have enabled him to evade capture even if his crimes had been discovered during his active period. Modern forensic analysis of evidence recovered from Crane's ranch has provided additional insights into his torture techniques and disposal methods, revealing procedures that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of anatomy, psychology, and chemistry that exceeded what would be expected from his documented educational background. This analysis suggests possible consultation with educated accomplices or access to specialized training that was not reflected in his official records. The continuing study of Crane's case has contributed to contemporary understanding of the psychological and environmental factors that can transform military veterans into systematic predators when combat trauma combines with social isolation and paranoid ideation to create dangerous behavioral patterns. This research has influenced modern approaches to veteran mental health services and community-based support systems. Federal agencies have used insights from the Crane case to develop improved screening procedures for identifying veterans whose military service and psychological condition require ongoing monitoring and specialized support services. These procedures emphasize early identification of warning signs and proactive intervention to prevent the development of dangerous behavioral patterns that could threaten public safety. The case has influenced contemporary research into the psychological effects of combat exposure and the specific environmental triggers that can activate trauma-related behavioral problems in military veterans. This research has contributed to improved treatment protocols for post-traumatic stress disorders and has enhanced understanding of the long-term psychological effects of exposure to systematic violence. Modern forensic psychology has identified Crane's case as representing a specific category of serial murder that combines military training with paranoid psychosis in ways that create extraordinary dangers for civilian populations. The case provides important insights into the psychological mechanisms and environmental factors that can transform legitimate security concerns into systematic predatory behavior. The psychological profile developed from analysis of Crane's case has been used to identify other historical cases involving military veterans whose combat trauma and social isolation created similar patterns of systematic criminal behavior. These comparative studies have revealed common psychological and environmental factors that contribute to the development of trauma-related criminal behavior in military veterans. Educational institutions throughout the former frontier region have incorporated the Crane case into curricula that examine the historical development of mental health understanding and the evolution of support services for military veterans. These educational programs emphasize the importance of recognizing and addressing psychological trauma to prevent the development of dangerous behavioral patterns. Law enforcement agencies continue to study the Crane case as an example of systematic criminal behavior that exploited the limitations of frontier law enforcement while demonstrating the importance of coordinated investigation techniques for identifying and apprehending dangerous individuals who operate in isolated locations. The site of the former Crane Ranch remains under federal protection as both a historical preserve and an active archaeological research location. Access is restricted, but educational programs provide opportunities for researchers and students to study the physical evidence of Crane's crimes and the investigative techniques that were developed for analyzing complex criminal operations. Memorial services conducted at the site have provided opportunities for descendant communities to honor the memory of Crane's victims and to reflect on the psychological and social factors that enabled such systematic criminal activity to occur without detection. These commemorative events emphasize the importance of maintaining community awareness and support systems to prevent similar tragedies. For those who contemplate the legacy of Josiah Crane and the innocent victims who suffered systematic torture and death at his isolated Wyoming ranch, the most disturbing realization is not simply the extent of his individual crimes, but the recognition that the psychological and environmental conditions that created his systematic predatory behavior could emerge in any context where military training, unresolved trauma, and social isolation combine to activate paranoid delusions about civilians. Populations. The empty Wyoming landscape that once witnessed Crane's systematic crimes serves as an eternal reminder that the greatest horrors of human experience often emerge not from external threats or wild predators, but from the twisted psychology of individuals whose minds have been damaged by exposure to violence and whose isolation prevents the social connections that might otherwise provide reality testing and emotional support necessary to prevent their descent into systematic evil. The wind that still sweeps across the former Crane Ranch carries with it the memory of at least 18 innocent victims whose only crime was traveling through territory, controlled by a man whose psychological deterioration had transformed legitimate security concerns into systematic torture and murder operations, driven by elaborate delusions that found mortal enemies in every innocent encounter with the outside world.